Picture a woman. Berlin, 1923. She's carrying a basket, not a handbag, not a purse, a basket. The kind you'd use for laundry. And inside that basket, stacked in tight, careless bricks, is money. Billions of marks, enough to fill it to the rim. She's going to buy a loaf of bread. This is not a metaphor. This happened. Wheelbarrows of cash for a single cup of coffee. Workers demanding to be paid twice a day, not out of greed, but because the money they received at noon was worth less by dinner. A man left his wheelbarrow full of cash outside a shop for 1 minute. Someone stole the wheelbarrow, left the money on the pavement. Germany, in 1923, was not a country in recession. It was a country where the concept of money itself had collapsed. And here's what nobody tells you about that moment. That basket of worthless bills didn't just destroy savings. It didn't just bankrupt families. It cracked open something far darker, a rage so deep, so humiliated, so desperate that it would hand a failed Austrian painter the keys to an entire nation. This is the story of how a printing press built the Third Reich. Part 1. The bill no one could pay. To understand what broke Germany, you need to understand what Germany thought it was. In 1914, the German mark was one of the most trusted currencies on earth. Germany was an industrial powerhouse: steel, chemicals, precision engineering. Its middle class was educated, proud, and deeply invested in stability. These were people who saved, people who believed in contracts, in institutions, in the promise that a mark today would still be a mark tomorrow. Then came the war, 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Millions dead. And Germany, unlike Britain or France, couldn't pay for it the conventional way, through taxes or foreign loans. The Kaiser's government had a simpler solution. They printed. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, Germany had already doubled its money supply. But nobody panicked yet. Wars are expensive. Things would stabilize. Germany would recover. Then came Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just humiliate Germany, it presented it with a bill. 132 billion gold marks in war reparations. A number so large that nobody, not even the men who wrote it, truly believed it could ever be paid in full. But it didn't matter whether it could be paid. What mattered was the psychological weight of it. Germany, a nation that had believed in its own greatness, was now formally declared guilty, irresponsible, indebted, to be bled. The government was caught between impossible choices. It couldn't raise taxes. The economy was shattered. It couldn't borrow. No one would lend. It could print, and so it did. At first, the inflation was manageable, uncomfortable, but survivable. A nuisance. The kind of thing economists argue about in university lecture halls, while ordinary people quietly notice that their grocery bill has crept up. But there is a threshold with inflation, a point of no return, a moment when trust in the currency doesn't erode slowly, it shatters. Germany was about to cross that line. And when it did, the people who suffered most weren't the ones you'd expect. Stay with me. Part 2. 4 trillion marks for a loaf of bread. By January 1923, $1 bought 18,000 marks. By November of the same year, just 10 months later, $1 bought 4,200 billion marks. Read that again. 4,200 billion in 10 months. The printing presses ran day and night. The ink dried faster than the paper could be cut. At one point, the German government was operating over 300 paper mills and nearly 2,000 printing houses, all dedicated exclusively to producing currency. Money was printed on one side only because there wasn't time to run it through the press twice. Here is the paradox nobody talks about. The people who survived the hyperinflation best were the ones with debt. If you'd borrowed money to buy a factory in 1920, by 1923 you could repay that entire loan with what amounted to pocket change. The debt evaporated. Industrialists, landowners, anyone with hard assets and paper liabilities, they came out the other side richer than before. But the German middle class, the teachers, the civil servants, the retired officers, the small shopkeepers, they had done everything right. They had saved. They had pension funds, life insurance policies, bonds, paper wealth carefully accumulated over decades, and every single mark of it was turning to dust in real time. A schoolteacher in Frankfurt watched her life savings, enough to buy a house, become insufficient to buy a single postage stamp. This is where the psychology becomes critical. It wasn't just poverty that radicalized Germany. Poverty alone rarely produces fascism. History has seen far poorer nations stay relatively stable. What radicalized Germany was the specific cruelty of this poverty. These were people who had played by the rules, worked hard, trusted the system. And the system had betrayed them, not through bad luck, but through deliberate policy. Their government had printed away their futures. The humiliation was total. And into that humiliation, into that very specific cocktail of shame, rage, and desperate need for someone to blame, a young man with a talent for speeches was beginning to find his audience. In 1923, Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in a Munich beer hall. It failed. He was arrested. He was laughed at, but he had found something that night, something more valuable than power. He had found the wound, and he spent the next 10 years pressing on it. Because here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The hyperinflation was eventually fixed. Germany stabilized, and yet Hitler still rose to power, which means the real damage wasn't economic at all. Part 3. Germany was fixed. The wound was not. In November 1923, Germany did something remarkable. It introduced a new currency, the rentenmark, backed not by gold, but by the total value of German agricultural and industrial land. It was, in essence, a currency backed by the country itself, and it worked. Almost overnight, the hyperinflation stopped. Prices stabilized. The wheelbarrows disappeared. By 1925, Germany was recovering. American loans were flowing in, and factories were running. The Roaring Twenties arrived in Berlin with particular enthusiasm. Cabarets, jazz, a cultural explosion. The Weimar Republic, for a brief moment, looked like it might actually work. Hitler, in this period, was irrelevant. His beer hall putsch had failed. He'd been imprisoned, written a book that most people dismissed, and was polling in the low single digits. If the story had ended in 1928, he would be a footnote. Then Wall Street collapsed. The Great Depression hit Germany with a savagery that was almost personal. The American loans dried up overnight. Unemployment went from 3% to over 30% in 3 years. And the middle class, that same group that had been burned by hyperinflation just 5 years earlier, felt the floor give way beneath them for the second time in a decade. This is the moment the wound reopened, because the hyperinflation hadn't just taken people's savings, it had taken their faith, their belief that institutions could protect them, that governments could be trusted, that playing by the rules was worth something. When the Depression came, that faith was already gone. There was no reservoir of goodwill left, no benefit of the doubt to extend to the Weimar politicians scrambling to respond. The German middle class didn't just want solutions, they wanted revenge against the bankers, against the Marxists, against Versailles, against the invisible forces they were convinced had conspired to destroy their lives. Hitler didn't create that anger. He simply arrived at the right moment with the right enemy and the right promise. Germany wasn't seduced by fascism. It was exhausted into it. And what happened next? What Hitler actually did with the German economy once he had power is one of the strangest financial stories of the 20th century. But that's a video for another day. Part 4. The contract was already broken. On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He hadn't overthrown anyone. He hadn't staged a military coup. He had won elections. 44% of Germans voted for his party. Another significant share voted for parties that then made him their coalition partner, believing they could control him, use him, then discard him when convenient. They were, of course, wrong. But here is what I keep coming back to. The woman with the basket, the man whose wheelbarrow was stolen, the schoolteacher in Frankfurt watching her savings dissolve. They didn't vote for genocide. They voted for someone who seemed to understand their humiliation, who named it, who promised to end it, who gave them a face to put on their suffering. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't right the Holocaust. No single economic event can bear that weight. But it did something that made everything that followed possible. It broke the contract. The unspoken agreement between a state and its citizens that if you work, if you save, if you trust the institutions, you will be protected, was voided by a printing press. And once that contract breaks, once people genuinely believe that the system is not merely flawed, but actively hostile to them, the door opens for anyone willing to offer a different contract, even a monstrous one. Germany was fixed economically in 1923. The currency stabilized. The numbers recovered. But the psychological scar never healed. It just went underground, waiting for the next crisis to pull it back to the surface. And in 1929, the next crisis came. The rest, as they say, is history. The darkest kind. What happened in Germany between 1918 and 1933 is not just a cautionary tale about inflation. It's a reminder that economic crises are never purely economic. They are crises of trust. And trust, once broken, between a government and its people, between a currency and its holders, between a system and those it was supposed to protect, doesn't repair itself when the numbers improve. It waits. If you've made it this far, you already understand that history isn't just dates and battles. It's the story of what money does to people. What debt does to nations. What happens when the invisible systems holding civilization together quietly start to fail. That's what this channel is about. If that matters to you, subscribe. There's much more to come. And if you want to know what Hitler actually did with the German economy once he had power, that story is even stranger than this one.